Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and today I will be starting the book Curious Tides. As you can see, it has something to do with magic. I will be getting the sequel to you guys whenever it comes out. And like I said, please, 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 pretty please, comment on this. I would really appreciate it. And this is what the back looks like. And a world that pulses and breathes with intricate magic and a mystery that spirals as deep and dark as it can go. Curious Tides is a marvel in atmosphere. There are tides that drown and tides that bind, tides with voices not all kind, moon-kissed tides with pitch-black eyes, and those that dance neath stranger skies. And the inside says, Emorys might be a student at the prestigious Aldrin College for Lunar Magics, but her healing abilities have always been mediocre at best, until a treacherous night in the Dovamere Sea Caves kills a group of her classmates and leaves her as the only survivor. Now Emorys is plagued by strange, impossible powers that no healer should possess, powers that would ruin her life if the wrong person were to discover them. To gain control of these new abilities, Emorys enlists the help of the school's most reclusive student, Baz, a boy already well versed in the deadly nature of darker magic, whose sister happened to be one of the drowned students, and Emorys' best friend. Determined to find the truth behind the drownings and the cult-like secret society she's convinced her classmates were involved in, Emorys is faced with even more questions when the supposedly drowned students start washing ashore alive, only for each to immediately die in a horrible magical death. And Emorys is not the only one seeking answers. When her new magic captures the society's attention, she finds herself drawn into the world of privilege and power, all while wondering if the truth she's searching for might lead her right back to Dovamere to face the fate she was never meant to escape. Now, I have already personally read this book, but for you guys, I will read it. This book has been copyrighted, and I am just reading it as for fun. So, and without further ado, here we go. And here's a map of Aldrin College. The sacred lunar houses and their tidal alignments. We're starting with House New Moon. Nova Luna Hall, healers, rising tide, ability to heal themselves and others. Seers, ebbing tide, gift of prophecy and psychic visions. Shadow guides, ability to see beyond the veil, communicate with spirits. Dark bearers, ebbing tide, darkness manipulation. House, waxing moon, crescent's hall. Sowers, ability to grow and alter plants and other small organisms. Glamours, ebbing tide, compulsion, charisma, and influence over others. Amplifiers, rising tide, ability to amplify the scope and range of other magics. Wordsmiths, ebbing tide, ability to manifest things into being. House full moon, Helena Hall. Soul tenders, emotional manipulation, empaths, and aura seers. Ward crafters, ebbing tide, ability to weave protection spells and ward magic. Purifiers, rising tide, ability to perform cleanses, balance energies, light keepers, ebbing tide, light manipulation. House, waning moon, decrescence hall, dreamers, dream manipulation, dream walking, ability to induce sleep, unravelers, ebbing tide, ability to unveil secrets and decipher codes, breaking through wards and spells, memorists, rising tide, ability to see and manipulate memories, reapers, ability to reap life, death touched. House eclipse, obscura hall. Lunar eclipses produce variations of other lunar magic. Solar eclipses produce rare new gifts beyond other lunar magics. Last spring, she was drowning in a sea of stars. Emery knew this was how she would die, smothered by the strange tide. Selfishly, she hoped the thing brushing against her was Romy. She didn't want to die alone in the darkness between stars were memories. She wished to forget a cave like a wound that stood inside his heart, the widening of Romy's eyes as the sea rushed in, swift and inevitable. We are born of the moon and tides, and to them we return. But Emery wasn't ready to go. The thought was a flimsy lifeline she reached for, hand seeking purchase in wet sand until they found a clammy, solid weight to grasp. Emery, Emery, the sea whispered, as if loath to let her go. It relinquished its hold as she hauled herself onto shore. The receding waves unveiled the shape of her anchor in the sand, and Emery jerked back, a scream lodged in her throat. A body, limbs bent and broken and wrong. The other bodies were strewn around it, blue lips parted on silent screams, but all Emery could think as she searched their pallid faces and unseeing eyes was how none of them were Romy. And if this was death, it was a cruel punishment to keep them apart at the end of all things. Your fault, the stars seemed to say. Emery couldn't find it in herself to refute them. Song of the Drowned Gods, Part 1, The Scholar on the Shores. There's a scholar on these shores who breathes stories. He inhales all manner of them, holds each one in his soul, and when his lungs are too full of words, he exhales at last, daring to breathe his own stories to life. Then he breathes in words and breathes more out, in and out and in again, like the measured rhythm of the sea, until one day he finds a peculiar book that sets even the tides off their faint course. There is a world at the center of all things, where drowned gods reign over a sea of ash. The book begins. There is an involuntary rule, for in the bleak world they have been marooned, forced to become dim echoes of their former glory, while they wait the heroes who might one day set them free. Can you hear their plea? It is a song that carries on the wind, like ash as it flutters across the worlds. And perhaps a piece of it lingers here on this very page. Look closer. Strain your ear. Drowned gods are calling. Will you answer? The story it tells captivates the scholar so much so that he finds himself beneath the colorless sky alone in the stillness of a great expanse of ash, the book still hanging from his hand, the only tangible thing in this curious world. Before he can make sense of it, he is pulled back to his college by the sea, where the book turns to dust in his hand, and the memory of the universe it contained already begins to fade. It feels to him like a dream, but for the taste of ash left in his mouth, a fine coating of it on his clothes and hair, and his unshakable belief that now courses through his veins. He has always viewed stories as a sailor might view their ship, vessels to carry their reader to other shores, other worlds, portals on a page. And here he has found such a portal, not a figurative one at all, not a figment of his imagination, but real. He has glimpsed a world beyond these shores. Here's an echo of it now between the stars, a symphony of drowned gods that beckon, come, seek us as we seek you. The scholar heeds their call, and thus our story begins. Chapter 1. Emorys. Today was the first day of a new moon, and on the banks of the Alder Sea the tide was low. There was a time when these facts meant nothing to Emorys Ainsleaf, but that was before the night her very life hinged on those details. Now the moon was no longer just a moon. The tide was something to fear, and though Emorys was grateful for the sun still shining in the late summer sky, unease gathered like stones in her stomach. Aldrin College for Lunar Magics rose up ahead, ivy-clad buildings crowning the steep hill that plunged into the restless sea below. Emorys dug her nails into her palm as the taste of salt water filled her mouth. A phantom impression she had yet to shake. Blood swelled from the wound. She closed her eyes, savoring the twinge of pain before the magic in her veins could heal it. It was an ordinary sort of pain, comforting almost. Nothing like the aching throb of images that surged in her mind. A blood-slick column of rock, the spiral burned in silver on her wrist, 4 bodies splayed on the sand as if coaxed free at the sight of Aldrin. That particular pain she couldn't heal away, no matter how she tried to ease it. Right, sorry about that, guys. I'm just changing my audio. This is page 8. Your new moon, then. Emorys startled. The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror, motioning to her hand, where the sigil of her lunar house glistened darkly on her pale skin. A black circle, wreathed in silver narcissus. It glared back at her, as if taking offense at the trickle of blood marring its surface. Guiltily she wiped at it, seeing only death in its delicate ink. What's your title alignment? Healing. The driver whistled an impressed note. His own hands gripping the wheel were bare. Everyone was born with the capacity for magic, a drop of it in their blood, but only those who proved proficient enough bore their house's sigil and studied at places like Aldrin. I've got a second cousin who's in House New Moon too, the driver said. Shadow guide. Works at a morgue up in Threnody. He repressed a visible shudder. grumbling something under his breath about how the dead should be left alone. Emery could almost hear the pointed comment Romy might have made. People fear what they don't understand, she would say, nose lifted up in disdain at such small-mindedness. But there's beauty in death, you know. Indeed, no one would ever dare frown upon a healer whose touch could prove more efficient than any modern medicine. But some magics, like a shadow guide's ability to commune with spirits, or a reaper's death touch, made most people uneasy, especially those with little to no magic. They don't understand like they don't understand like we do. That death is just as much a part of the sacred cycle as life, Romy would say. This is page 9. It didn't make losing her any easier. Here we go, the driver exclaimed as the cab crested the hill. Aldrin College. Everything in Emorys seized as the heavy iron gates creaked their welcome. Silver-wrought motto splitting down the middle as they opened. Post tenebras lux iterum atque eram. After darkness, light, again and again. All right. Sorry for the interruption, guys. Gravel crunched beneath the cab's wheels. Emery had a sudden urge to tell the driver to stop, turn back, but the gates closed behind them with a clang of finality. Nerves rattled on the heels of nausea as she took in the familiar stone steps up to the inner courtyard, flanked by towering elms. Here the driver stopped. Emery handed him a few coins, clutched the strap of her bag. No sooner had she stepped out of the cab than she'd wished she'd stayed in it. Forever. Already missing the anonymity of that liminal space, the feeling of being nowhere and no one for as long as she remained between the life she left at home this very morning and the one waiting for her at Aldrin, the person she would have to become here. Her heart thundered in her chest as she climbed those 8 steps, one for each of the moon phases. A step for new moon, 3 for the waxing, 1 for the full moon, and 3 for the waning. She faltered at the top, just as she had last year, though her nerves back then had been tinged with excitement, not dread. This is it, college at last, Romy had mused on their first day of freshman year, all starry-eyed as she took in the fabled campus. We get to reinvent ourselves here, be whoever we please. And though Emily had been eager to do just that, she never understood why someone like Romy would want to be anyone but herself, so effortlessly charming and unique in a way Emery had only ever dreamed of being. This is page 10. For Emery, college was a chance to be known as more than what she had been all her life. The girl who hailed from nowhere, who always came second best, who'd been terrified of not getting into Aldrin because her magic was wholly unremarkable compared to her best friend's. It offered a clean slate, the first page, and a new notebook, just waiting to be filled. She ran a finger along the scar on the inside of her wrist, a silver spiral that started at the base of her thumb and stopped at the tangle of stark blue veins at her pulse point. Her gaze went to the fountain at the center of the lawn where the tides of fate guarded the names of the drowned. It was too late now to erase what had been written in silver and blood, she thought. Too late to even ponder such things. It seemed the quad was void of its usual hum of activity, as the few stragglers hurrying through the cloisters made Emily realize just how late her train had been, and as the dean's voice echoed from the assembly hall, where she was giving her usual welcome speech. Emery swore. As much as she dreaded this part, yearned to run to her dorm instead and shut herself in it, and avoid everyone on campus for the rest of term. She had come back for a reason, equipped with a plan, and it all started here. She tried to ease into the dark wood-paneled room unnoticed, but the heavy door slipped from her grasp and slammed shut behind her. Heads turned her way. Emily's cheeks burned, and for a split second she caught herself searching the sea of faces for the one person who might have made this easier. She could almost picture it, Romy waving at her over the seat she would have saved for her, an anchor in the storm, as she'd always been before everything had changed, and the girl that Emery had known since childhood started slipping away, swept up by something more sinister than the tide that took her. Page 11. But Romy was not here, and neither apparently was Romy's brother. Relief and guilt churned in Emery's stomach at his absence. Before she could dwell on that, she tightened her fingers around her satchel and took the first empty seat she could find. Chin held high, she tried to adopt the devil-may-care attitude Romy might have had in her place, but still she felt the furtive glances thrown her way, and the murmurs rising. That's the girl who came back from the caves, the student who survived the beast, the one who the tide did not claim. Dean Fulton called for silence. I must insist once more that students stay clear of Dovermere Caves. After the tragic events of last spring, it begs repeating. Dovermere is unsafe, its tides unpredictable, and as such it remains strictly off-limits. Her dark eyes flitted toward Emery as she continued. I urge you to remember those who have fallen. Remember Quince Travers and Serena Villan of House New Moon, and Dania and Leah Azula of House Waxing Moon. Remember Daphne Diori and Jordan Breyer Burke of House Full Moon, and Harlow Kerr and Romy Brisden of House Waxing Moon. Remember their names. Honor them by ensuring no one ever knows the same horrible fate. There is no glory to be found in those caves, only death. Emery's nails dug into her skin again, and the students looked her way. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to break. She spent months preparing for this moment, hoping the summer holiday might allow for things to settle, for the shock of tragedy to fade, and the students of Aldrin College to forget, as she had tried so desperately to. 8 of her classmates dead, and Emery the only one left standing. She thought the images that burned her eyes might be visible for all to see. 9 freshmen standing in a circle around a column of rock, their bloody wrists bearing spiral mark that glowed silver in the dark. The sound of the tide rushing in earlier than it should have, death eager to have its fill. The sea and the stars, and her name whispered in her ear. Bodies on the sand. Foolish of her, really, to think about such a thing might be so easily forgotten. The dean kept talking, but Emery didn't hear a word. Only when students stopped staring did she let out a breath, slowly uncurling her fists. Blood bloomed beneath her nails. Her palms were a mess, but already her wounds were smoothing over, her healing magic surging with barely a thought from her to answer. The pull of the new moon that governed it, she latched onto the small comfort as the pressure in her veins lessened. All summer she'd felt this inexplicable pressure, like an itch she couldn't scratch, that grew to a painful throb unless she drew blood. She eyed the row of windows behind the dean, wary of the breeze they let in. She swore she heard a whisper slithering in, the sea calling to her, looking to wrap around her limbs, desperate to pull her down, down, down toward the deep. Emorys saw him out of the corner of her eye. He sat a few rows away, a barrier between her and the windows. The sea beyond. Dusty light fell on the side of his face as he peered at her over his shoulder, casting the rest of his features in shadows. His unflinching stare pulled her up to the surface, made everything go quiet. She recognized his boyish good looks, those thick-lashed eyes. They were the first things she'd seen after waking next to those broken and bloated bodies. "You're alive," she remembered him saying, his words nearly drowned out by the swelling tide. "You're all right." And she'd clung to them so desperately. Those words, a life raft keeping her afloat. Kieran Dunhall Thornby was the perfect embodiment of his lunar house, the bright light of a full moon, bursting with promise, and his presence alone had chased away all the darkness from that moonless night. He looked at her now with such intensity, as if he needed to see that she was indeed still alive. Everyone around them began to disappear, and for a second it felt like they were back on the beach, shivering against the horrors strewn around them. But then she blinked. He turned away, and just like that, the moment dissolved between them like sea foam across the sand. Emorys struck a spiral mark on her wrist, half expecting it to start glowing silver like it had when it first appeared through whatever odd ancient magic lived in Dovemere. She remembered the way Kieran had grabbed her wrist that night, the curious expression on his face as he frowned at the mark that was mirrored on his own wrist. Two spirals, a dull silver on their skin. It had haunted her all summer. How impossible it was that he should be marked with the same symbol because he wasn't in the caves that night, hadn't been there for the ritual that marked each student foolish enough to have been. Still, he'd found her on the beach in the middle of the night, as if he'd been waiting for her, for someone to make it out of those caves alive. He knew something about what happened in Dovemere. She was certain of it. It was the only reason she'd bothered coming back to Aldrin. The one thing that managed to pull her out of this ocean of grief she'd been drowning in. She would stop at nothing now to get answers. "And I wish all of you an enlightening term. Thank you." The dean's parting words pulled Emery from her daze. Students were already out of their chairs, chattering excitedly as they exchanged handshakes and pats on the back and questions about each other's summers. She felt painfully disconnected from it all. Gaze fixed on Kieran, she steeled herself for what she needed to do. Her thoughts. Give me 1 second, guys. The dean's parting words pulled Emery from her daze. Students were already out of their chairs, chattering excitedly as they exchanged handshakes and pats on the back, and questions about each other's summers. She felt painfully disconnected from it all. Gaze fixed on Kieran, she steeled herself for what she needed to do. Her thoughts raced in tandem with her heart as she mentally listed all the questions she wanted to ask him. Just walk up to him, she told herself. It's as simple as that. None of it felt simple, though. Without Romy here to do all the talking for her, it was up to Emery. It was up to Emery now to be bold, something her quiet, timid self balked at. Kieran's eyes found hers as she approached, and she was glad her steps didn't falter. She balled her clammy hands into fists at her side, pushed her trepidation down, and stopped short as a group of upperclassmen caught up to Kieran, stealing his attention away from her. Ladies and gentlemen, I may only get you one chapter today, but later on I will do chapter 2 if you really want me to continue. Emery watched, deflated, as a pretty redhead girl kissed him on the cheek, and a few boys clasped his hand enthusiastically, and through it all Kieran smiled, a dimpled smile, such ease and charm emanating from him that it was hard to reconcile the image with the half-drenched boy in her mind. She thought she heard her name being spoken in the chaos of voices. Someone waved at her from halfway across the hall, Penelope West, one of the few friends Emery had made outside of Romeo last year, and a fellow New Moon student. She shared most of her classes with. She'd always liked Penelope, but with her too bubbly nature and chattiness that could go on forever, she thought, of facing her, of facing anyone really, was suddenly unbearable. Getting answers from Kieran would have to wait. Before Penelope could reach her, Amory slipped quietly from the assembly hall, yearning for the solace of her room. The noonday sun beat down on the quad, great curtains of it falling between the columns that lined the cloisters. Amory cut across the lawn toward the underclassmen dormitories. She slowed near the fountain where the tides of fate, Bruma, Anima, Aestas, and Quies, cast long shadows on the ground. The four deities who ruled over the lunar houses stood in the middle of the basin with their backs to each other, forming a circle in the proper order of the cycle they represented. Young Bruma of the new moon, beautiful Anima of the waxing moon, motherly Aestas of the full moon, and wise old Quies of the waning moon. Appropriately, the sunlight touched only Anima and Aestas, casting the other two in shadow. Each tide had a different path to one of the four academic halls. There were there was moody Novaluna Hall, its door painted black like the new moon sky that gave those of Emrys house the powers of cleansing darkness, divination, vibrant Crescent's Hall, which thought to those born on a waxing moon the magic tied to growth, amplification, and manifestation. Stately Helena Luna Hall, which catered to those who bore the power of the full moon, tied to light, protection, purity, and mindfulness, and Decrescent's Hall, as dark, as mysterious as the waning moon students who dealt in secrets and dreams, memories and death, and who had been Romy's peers when she was alive. There was a fifth hall too, but no tide watched over House Eclipse, and no path led to its door. A nondescript, nearly hidden thing. Ambling stopped by the fountain. Her fingers skimmed the surface of the secret water. Said to have been blessed by the tides themselves. The water came from Dovemere, a network of caves as mythical as the tides, and part of what had attracted Aldrin's founders to build their college so close to it. Students were expressly forbidden to take water from the fountain, much less use it in their bloodletting practices. A way for those of the four main lunar houses to access their magic whenever their ruling moon phase wasn't in position. Their power otherwise remained dormant in their blood, still touching the water was meant to be grounding. It wasn't. Emery noticed the delicate flowers floating on the surface, two for each lunar house: black narcissus, indigo hollyhocks, white orchids, purple black poppies. 8 flowers, one for each of the names that she knew had been added to the silver plaques at the tide's feet. Souls consigned to their care so they might watch over them in the deep. A name and a flower for each student claimed by the sea. And suddenly the flowers weren't flowers at all, but bodies trapped in a cave with a deadly seal around them. Emily turned from the fountain just as the door to House Eclipse opened. The student who emerged made her stomach plummet. Basil Brewston was tall and long-limbed, with a badly buttoned shirt and unruly brown curls that fell to his chin. He hugged a pile of books close to his chest, head bent low as if he were trying to make himself smaller, or perhaps invisible. Baz had long since succeeded as both. He was a ghost, a hermit, a curiosity, only whispered about in the darkest corners of the college. The Time Spinner. Such a rare magic, even for one of the Eclipse born. Baz turned toward the fountain. Rich brown eyes met hers, and were it not for the thick-framed glasses they hid behind, Emily might have thought it was Romy staring back at her. They had the same pale, freckled skin, the same protruding ears, but Baz lacked his sister's sense of mischief. That jerky, faraway look Romy would get had always infuriated her professors. The bright curiosity that spread like wildfire until it consumed all she was and could have been. Baz's eyes held none of Romy's bold fire, only timid uncertainty as he greeted her with an awkward "Emery." He looked like he might make a run for it to avoid this conversation altogether. She couldn't blame him. "You missed the assembly," Emery said, if only just to say something to fill the silence and drown out the guilt that threatened to choke her, as Romy's face flashed in her mind, not as if not as it had appeared in life, but as Emily last remembered seeing it, pale and stark in those fateful moments before the sea took her away. Page 17. Um, where was I? How Baz must resent her for surviving what his sister had not. He blinked toward the assembly hall, where the laughter sounded as students spilled into the quad. "I guess I did." From his expression, Emery couldn't quite work out if he'd missed it on purpose or forgotten about the assembly entirely. She noted the tightness around his mouth and wondered when the last time he laughed was. She remembered how quick he'd been to smile as a boy, and what now felt like another lifetime entirely, when she and Romy and him had attended boarding school together, sneaking out to run barefoot in the wildflower fields behind it, as free and unburdened as the gulls they would chase down to the beach. Baz adjusted the weight of the books in his arms. How are you? How have you been? Emily smiled past the lump in her throat, forcing a smile. Fine. Through the nearby cloisters, she spotted Kieran and his group of friends. Their talk of heading down to the beach for the start of term bonfires carried on the breeze, and though Kieran's attention was on them, Emery got the distinct impression he had been looking at her only a moment before. We missed you at the funeral. Her attention snapped back to Baz. There was no bitterness in his voice, no reproach, and that made it so much worse. Because if he knew the truth, if he knew what really happened in those caves, he wouldn't have wanted her there to begin with. Emery's cheeks reddened as she tried to think of an excuse, but the truth of it was, she had none. She meant to go, had told him she would when he'd invited her right before they left for the summer, but the thought of facing Romy's mother, of lying to Baz about what happened, of saying goodbye to her best friend while Emery got to live, she couldn't do it. She couldn't stand the empathic way Baz looked at her now, couldn't bear this guilt. That clawed at her insides. Knowing he must have so many questions, none none of which she could answer. I'm sorry, she said quietly, averting her eyes. I, uh, I have to get going, but I'll see you around. Baz hugged his books tighter, shoulders drooping in relief or disappointment, she couldn't tell. Emery couldn't get away from him fast enough. Reaching her old room felt like crossing an ocean. The underclassmen dorm stood on the far side of campus. A plain store sorry, I'm so sorry guys. I'm messing up. Stone building, overrun with ivy, where students of all houses were mixed in together, paired off into rooms no matter the sigil inked on their skin. It was only in their third year at Aldrin that they joined housing facilities specific to their respective lunar houses. Emery fumbled miserably with the key to her room until the lock gave way at last, and she hurried inside, head falling back against the door. She blew a heavy sigh, grateful for the quiet. Her breath caught painfully as she took in the room. On one side was her narrow metal frame bed, just as she had left it, with its dark linens and duvet perfectly tucked in. There was the mahogany armoire, where her clothes lay forgotten, and the small desk crammed in the corner, still covered with neatly stacked books and fountain pens. Everything appeared untouched by the passing of time, as though the past 4 months never happened, and Emery had never left, and everything was still the same as it once was. Except it wasn't, because the other side of the room, Romeo's side of the room was bare. The bed was still there, the armoire and the desk, but everything that once made it Romy's, the mismatched art and obscure books, the messy piles of clothing, and rare prickly plants, of forgotten cups of tea and plates riddled with crumbs. Those things were gone now, taken away like the tide took Rome himself. There was not a trace of her left, but Emery's mind conjured her all the same, recalling the last time they'd been here together. That day Romy had been hunched over her desk, swathed in a shaft of dwindling sunlight that made her shoulder-length hair shine copper. When Emery came in, she startled, knocking over a teacup. "Tides, are you trying to give me a heart attack?" Irritation laced her words as she righted the cup. Dusk, the stray cat she'd found on the school grounds the first week at Aldrin, and taken in despite the rules against keeping pets in the dorms, jumped off her lap with an indignant meow to perch on the windowsill instead. Emery dropped the books on her own desk. "Well, it is a new moon. Could be a good way to test my healing skills on a live subject." Romy didn't seem in the mood for jokes. She furiously wiped the tea from the paper stacked haphazardly on her desk, angling her body as if to shield them from Emery. Ouch. Sorry, guys. I'm having to readjust, so I apologize. "What's so interesting you couldn't be bothered to meet me for supper? I'm stuck listening to Penelope talk about dark berry magic for what felt like hours." Emery tried to keep her tone light, but it came out sharp-edged, loaded. She couldn't help it. Romy had been acting all kinds of strange lately, constantly disregarding their plans, withdrawn and secretive in a way she'd never been before. In truth, Emery had noticed a change in her from the moment they'd arrived at Aldrin. She hadn't wanted to see it at first, blaming their heavy workload and differing schedules for the rift that had opened between them. They'd known each other since they were 10 years old. They'd shared everything, but something had shifted, and Emery was too scared to ask why that was, too scared of losing her one true friend. "You're just research," Emery said distractedly, as she gathered her tea-stained papers and stuffed them in her satchel. "I cannot read today. I'm so sorry, guys." Emery eyed the rumpled state of Romy's clothes, her unmade bed. "Have you been sleeping all afternoon?" "I was practicing. Dreamer stuff." Dreamer stuff. It was what she'd been saying for the past few months, brushing off every moment she spent in the sleepscape, the realm of dreams, like it was nothing, like it wasn't hollowing her out, depleting her of the bright energy she used to glow with. "You can't keep doing this, Ro. Missing class, spending all the time in dreams. It can't be healthy. I'm fine." The bags under your eyes beg to differ. "You wouldn't understand." Romy shouldered her bag and moved towards the door. Something gripped Emery at the side of her hand on the knob, as though she knew that if Romy walked out then, the rift between them would become an unbridgeable chasm. "Ro, I'm serious. Is everything all right with you?" She watched the tension in her friend's shoulders ease, and when Romy turned to her, lips upturned in a signature smile, brown eyes molten in the golden hour light, she thought perhaps she might have imagined these past weeks, months, that everything might still be the same between them. "Everything's fine again." She stood there for a moment, and though her smile never wavered, a shadow of doubt darkened her face. Emily thought she might come clean it then, finally spill the secret she'd been letting consume her, but Romy merely pulled the door open and said, "I'll see you later, all right?" Once the door shut behind her, Emery looked at Romy's desk, too curious and concerned to let it go. Forgotten beneath a vial of salt water, half stained with tea, was a piece of parchment artfully burnt around the edges. The letters S.O. were stamped in the middle of the note. Emery flipped it over where an inscription had been written in sprawling silver script. "Dovermere Cave, 10 p.m. She put the note back where she'd found it, dread making her mouth taste like ash. Students tended to avoid Dovemere Cove because the dark stain its infamous sea caves cast on it. Tales of all the drownings that took place there over the years were the first thing freshmen were told when starting at Aldrin. There were always a few foolhardy students who went into the caves looking to prove something to their peers, though Emory didn't think Romy would be reckless enough to do so. Yet, when the clock neared 10 and Romy still hadn't come back to their room, panic seized her. She looked at the note again, wondering what SO might stand for, and if it had anything to do with Romy's change in behavior. Unable to shake the sense of foreboding in her bones, Emory pocketed the note and went down to Dovemere Cove, just in time to see Romy and 7 other students slip into the caves where they would meet their end. Emory shook the haunting image of that night from her mind. The room suddenly felt too stuffy, too small. She rushed to the stained glass window between the beds and threw it open, letting the breeze in to kiss her face. She took a deep breath, then another, and the panic that wanted to pull her under slowly receded. Pressing her forehead against the window frame, she swore softly. Maybe coming back to Aldrin had been a mistake. All summer she had been able to pretend that dreadful night at the caves had never happened. She could look out at the alder sea and not feel the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, because even though home and Aldrin bordered the same sea, they did not share the same shore, nor the same painful memories of darkness and drowning. But now Emery glanced at her friend's empty side of the room, and all she could see were the things she could have done differently. If she'd said something to keep Romy from walking out that door, if she hadn't gone after her, if she hadn't been inside those caves, if she'd been quick enough, powerful enough to save everyone, healed them, and she'd healed herself, if she'd stayed home, she wouldn't have to wonder. She could shut everything out and not have to face the suffocating guilt. But she had tried doing exactly that this summer. Sheltered up in her room, ignoring everything and everyone until the sight of that mark on her wrist and the spiraling nightmares of that night and the feeling of wrongness in her blood drove her out of her stupor at last. And she'd known that she had no choice but to go back to seek answers as to why those students went into the caves and ensure no one else met the same fate. It was what Romy would have done had the rules been reversed. The hint of her voice slithered in through the still open window. Or maybe it was just the breeze. In the courtyard below, Emery glimpsed Kieran near the fountain. The ghost of his gaze on her lingered, the intensity of it raising the hairs on the back of her neck. You're alive. You're all right. She promptly shut the window, throwing the room into silence once more, and made her way to the armoire. She had a bonfire to go to. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the prologue, the tide houses and their alignments, and chapter 1 of Curious Tides. Please comment in the comments what you think, and I will get you another chapter either tonight or tomorrow. Thank you, beautiful bookworms, and have a good day.